Chapter 1, Before the River, the Desert. Long before Egypt became synonymous with pyramids, golden gods, and pharaohs immortalized in stone, there was only silence. An ancient silence, broken only by the hot wind sweeping across the vast arid plains of northeastern Africa. The desert dominated almost everything. Sand, rock, and sky. At first glance, it seemed an impossible place for the birth of a civilization. And yet, it was there that one of the most enduring societies in human history began to take shape. About 10,000 years ago, the landscape was different. The climate of the region we now know as Egypt was more humid. Seasonal rains fed lakes, savannas, and green areas where human groups lived as hunter-gatherers. They followed herds, collected wild fruits, and constantly adapted to the environment. Life was nomadic, uncertain, and dependent on the whims of nature. Over the millennia, however, the climate changed. The rains diminished, lakes dried up, and the savanna slowly transformed into desert. As the land became hostile, human groups were forced to seek a new refuge. That refuge had a simple name but extraordinary power: the Nile. The Nile River was not merely a source of water. It was a lifeline cutting through the desert like a blue serpent. While everything around it dried and died, its banks remained fertile. Every year, its waters overflowed, flooding the nearby fields and depositing a layer of dark, nutrient-rich silt. When the waters receded, the land was ready for planting. It was there, in this absolute contrast between death and life, that the first permanent settlements began to emerge. Men, women, and children settled near the river. They learned to plant cereals such as wheat and barley, to domesticate animals, and to store food. For the first time, the future could be planned. The predictable cycle of the Nile's floods offered something rare in prehistory: stability. That stability changed everything. With surplus food, not everyone needed to hunt or farm anymore. Some began to specialize in other activities: crafting tools, building boats, observing the skies, recording information. The division of labor was born there, driven directly by the rhythm of the river. The Nile also united. Unlike other regions where rivers separated territories, in Egypt the river functioned as a natural highway. Simple reed boats could easily navigate northward with the current and southward with the wind. People, ideas, beliefs, and goods began to circulate. Communities that had once been isolated started to recognize themselves as part of something greater. Over time, villages became towns. Towns grew and turned into rudimentary cities. Each one depended on the Nile, revered its floods, and feared its whims. When the inundation was weak, famine threatened. When it was too strong, homes were destroyed. Thus, the river came to be seen not only as a natural resource but as a divine force. Egyptian spirituality was born from this intimate relationship with the environment. The Nile was not merely water, it was order amid chaos. While the desert symbolized the unknown, death, and danger, the Nile Valley represented life, continuity, and balance. This opposition would profoundly shape the Egyptian worldview. It was in this context that the first leaders emerged. Initially, they were local chiefs responsible for organizing collective labor, digging canals, protecting grain stores, coordinating planting and harvesting. Their authority came not only from strength, but from their ability to ensure that the Nile cycle was used to its fullest. Gradually, these chiefs became rulers. Their territories expanded. Conflicts arose, as did alliances. The need to control access to fertile land became central. Whoever dominated the banks of the Nile held power. Over centuries, two great kingdoms formed: Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, near the river's delta. Both shared the same vital dependence on the Nile, but developed distinct identities. Even so, the river continued to connect them, physically and symbolically. Egypt was no longer merely a collection of agricultural communities. It was becoming a civilization. All of this, agriculture, social organization, religion, political power, was born from careful observation of nature. The Egyptian people learned to read the behavior of the Nile as one reads a sacred text. Its floods marked the calendar. Its retreat announced the moment to plant. Its course defined paths, borders, and destinies. Before temples, before pharaohs, before pyramids, there was the river. And as the desert advanced silently around it, the Nile continued to flow, patient and eternal, preparing the ground for one of the most fascinating civilizations the world has ever known. In the next chapter, we will see how this relationship between humanity and the river transformed into myth, religion, and power, giving rise to the first Egyptian gods and to the idea that Egypt itself was a divine creation shaped by water. Chapter 2: When the river became a god. As generations passed and life along the Nile grew more structured, the relationship between the people and the river deepened. What began as dependence slowly transformed into reverence. The Nile was no longer seen merely as a force of nature, but as a living presence, one that gave, took, warned, and sustained. In the minds of the early Egyptians, such power could not be accidental. It had to be divine. Every year, the people watched the horizon anxiously, waiting for the river to rise. The inundation did not come at random. It followed a rhythm, a cycle so reliable that it seemed guided by an unseen intelligence. When the waters arrived on time and at the right height, crops flourished and communities prospered. When they failed, suffering followed. From this fragile balance, Egyptian religion was born. The annual flood became sacred. The Egyptians divided the year according to the behavior of the Nile. Ake, the season of inundation, Parat, the season of emergence and planting, and Shimu, the season of harvest. Time itself was organized around the river. The calendar, agriculture, labor, and ritual were all synchronized with its pulse. To explain this order, the Egyptians turned to myth. They believed the Nile's floods were linked to the gods, especially to Hapi, the deity who personified the inundation. Hapi was not a god of war or destruction, but of abundance and fertility. He was depicted with a full belly and flowing forms, symbolizing nourishment and life. When the floods were generous, it was said that Hapi was pleased. When they failed, the gods were displeased and rituals intensified. But the Nile's sacred role extended beyond Hapi. The river became woven into the very structure of the Egyptian cosmos. The waters were associated with Nun, the primordial chaos from which creation itself had emerged. In Egyptian belief, before the world existed, there was only an endless ocean. Creation began when a mound of land rose from those waters, just as fertile land rose each year from the Nile's flood. Thus, every inundation was a reenactment of creation. The land, renewed annually by the river, was a living symbol of rebirth. This belief profoundly shaped how Egyptians understood life and death. If the land could die and return each year, so too could the human soul. The Nile did not merely sustain the living, it promised continuity beyond death. As these ideas took root, religious centers began to emerge along the riverbanks. Simple shrines evolved into temples where priests observed the river, recorded flood levels, and interpreted divine will. One of the most important tools developed during this time was the Nilometer, a structure used to measure the height of the Nile's waters. Though practical in function, it was deeply religious in meaning. Measuring the river was, in essence, measuring the favor of the gods. The priests who controlled this knowledge gained immense influence. They could predict prosperity or famine, advise leaders, and guide rituals meant to appease divine forces. Religion, science, and governance were inseparable, all rooted in the behavior of the Nile. At the same time, the idea of Ma'at emerged, the principle of cosmic order, balance, and harmony. The Nile embodied Ma'at. Its regularity stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the surrounding desert. Maintaining Ma'at became a sacred duty, not only of priests but of rulers. To govern was to preserve balance just as the river did. This belief laid the foundation for divine kingship. As communities grew larger and more complex, leadership required legitimacy beyond force. The ruler was no longer just an organizer of labor or a protector of land. He became the intermediary between gods and people. The early kings of Egypt were seen as chosen by the gods to maintain Ma'at, ensuring that the Nile would continue its life-giving cycle. In this way, political power was sanctified. The river itself reinforced this unity. From the narrow valley of Upper Egypt to the wide delta of Lower Egypt, the Nile flowed as a single artery. Despite regional differences, all communities shared the same gods, the same rituals tied to the floods, and the same dependence on the river's rhythm. Religion became a unifying force, binding the land together through shared belief. Even burial practices reflected the central role of the Nile. Cemeteries were often placed on the western bank where the sun set, symbolizing death and the journey to the afterlife, while cities of the living thrived on the eastern bank where the sun rose. The daily movement of the sun across the river mirrored the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth, all anchored by the Nile's presence. Myth, geography, and daily life became inseparable. Stories were told of gods sailing the heavens as they sailed the river. The solar bark of Ra crossed the sky by day and the underworld by night, just as boats crossed the Nile between the realms of the living and the dead. To the Egyptian mind, the universe itself functioned like the great river. By the end of this period, the Nile was no longer simply the reason people lived where they did. It had become the axis of existence, spiritual, political, and cosmic. The land was sacred because the river made it so. The people were chosen because the gods had blessed them with its waters. Egypt was beginning to see itself not just as a place, but as a divine order made manifest on earth. In the next chapter, this sacred worldview will collide with human ambition. As power consolidates and kingdoms expand, the need to control the Nile, its land, labor, and meaning, will lead to conflict, unification, and the rise of the first pharaohs. Chapter 3: The River of Power and the Birth of the Pharaoh. As belief solidified and communities along the Nile became bound by shared gods and rituals, another force quietly grew alongside religion: power. Control of land, water, and labor became the foundation upon which authority was built. In a world governed by the rhythm of the Nile, whoever mastered that rhythm could command the future. From this reality emerged one of the most distinctive political systems in human history. The fertile land along the river was narrow and precious. Beyond it stretched the desert, harsh and unforgiving. This natural boundary limited expansion outward and instead encouraged growth along the length of the Nile. Villages clustered close together, and as populations increased, competition for fertile ground intensified. Disputes over land, irrigation canals, and harvests became inevitable. To manage these challenges, stronger leaders arose. Initially, these leaders governed small territories, organizing irrigation projects and directing communal labor. Canals had to be dug and maintained, dikes reinforced, and floodwaters carefully guided to prevent destruction while maximizing fertility. Such large-scale coordination required authority, planning, and obedience. Those who could provide order prospered. Those who could not were replaced. Over time, successful leaders expanded their influence. Through alliances, marriage, and warfare, smaller chiefdoms were absorbed into larger ones. The Nile made this expansion possible. Armies and supplies could be transported efficiently by boat, while communication along the river remained constant. Control of the waterway meant control of movement, trade, and military power. Gradually, two dominant regions emerged once again: Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. Each developed its own symbols, crowns, and patron deities, yet both were united by the same lifeline. The struggle between these two lands would define an era. But power alone was not enough to rule Egypt. To govern such a land, legitimacy was essential. The ruler had to be more than a warrior or administrator. He had to embody Ma'at. He had to ensure the Nile flooded properly, that the gods were honored, and that balance prevailed. Thus, kingship became inseparable from divinity. The ruler was no longer merely chosen by the gods, he was part God himself. This belief gave rise to the concept of the pharaoh, a living embodiment of divine order on earth. The pharaoh stood at the intersection of heaven and land, responsible for maintaining harmony between the cosmic and the human. If the Nile failed, it was not seen as a natural disaster alone, but as a sign that Ma'at had been disrupted. The unification of Egypt was both a political and a sacred act. Around 3100 BCE, tradition tells of a southern king, often identified as Narmer or Menes, who succeeded in uniting Upper and Lower Egypt under a single crown. Whether achieved through conquest, diplomacy, or both, this moment marked the birth of the Egyptian state. The two lands became one, bound by the Nile and ruled by a single divine king. Symbols reinforced this unity. The pharaoh wore the double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. He ruled from a centralized authority, yet his power flowed outward along the river, reaching even the most distant settlements. The Nile was the spine of the kingdom, carrying royal decrees as surely as it carried grain and stone. With unification came administration. To govern such a vast territory, the pharaoh relied on officials, scribes, and priests. Writing, developed earlier for record-keeping, became essential. Taxes were levied in grain, measured according to the Nile's flood levels. Storehouses were built to hold surplus, ensuring stability during years of poor inundation. The state became a reflection of the river's cycle: collecting, storing, distributing. The pharaoh's authority extended into every aspect of life. He commanded labor for irrigation projects, temples, and later, monumental tombs. These works were not seen as burdens but as sacred duties. By building in service of the gods and the king, the people believed they were helping sustain Ma'at itself. The Nile's predictability made such massive projects possible, freeing labor during the inundation season when fields lay submerged. Religion, economy, and politics were now fully intertwined. Yet the pharaoh was not an absolute tyrant in the modern sense. His power was bound by expectation. He was judged by the prosperity of the land, the regularity of the floods, and the well-being of his people. A successful reign was one where the Nile rose faithfully, harvests were plentiful, and order prevailed. Failure invited chaos, and divine disfavor. Death, too, reflected the centrality of the river. The pharaoh's journey into the afterlife was imagined as a continuation of his earthly role. He would sail with the sun god Ra, crossing the cosmic waters as he once ruled the Nile. His tombs were placed strategically along the western bank, aligned with the river and the stars, ensuring eternal harmony between land, sky, and water. By the end of this era, Egypt had transformed completely. What began as scattered settlements clinging to a fertile riverbank had become a unified kingdom, ruled by a god-king and sustained by one of the most sophisticated systems of environmental management in the ancient world. The Nile was no longer just the giver of life, it was the foundation of empire. In the next chapter we will explore how this power was expressed in stone. As belief in eternity grew, the Egyptians turned to monumental architecture, transforming the landscape itself into a testament to their relationship with the Nile and the gods. Chapter 4: Stone, Eternity, and the Architecture of the Nile. As the pharaoh's authority solidified and Egypt stood unified beneath a single crown, the relationship between power, belief, and the Nile found its most enduring expression in stone. What had once been temporary structures of mud, brick, and reed evolved into monuments meant to last forever. This transformation was not driven by vanity alone, but by a profound conviction: eternity could be built. The Nile made this vision possible. Each year, as the inundation submerged the fields, agricultural labor paused. Thousands of workers were suddenly free, fed by stored grain and organized by the state. Rather than remaining idle, they were mobilized for grand projects. The rhythm of the river dictated the rhythm of construction, just as it governed every other aspect of Egyptian life. Stone quarries along the Nile's course became lifelines of a different kind. Limestone, granite, and sandstone were extracted, shaped, and transported by boat. Without the river, moving such massive blocks across vast distances would have been impossible. The Nile was not only a source of life, but a conveyor of eternity. Early royal tombs reflected evolving beliefs about the afterlife. Initially simple mastabas, flat-roof structures built of mud brick, they housed the deceased and the goods believed necessary for life beyond death. Over time, these tombs grew more complex and more permanent. Stone replaced brick and scale increased dramatically. This evolution reached its apex in the Old Kingdom with the construction of the pyramids. The pyramid was more than an architectural achievement, it was a cosmic symbol. Its shape echoed the primeval mound that rose from the waters of chaos at the moment of creation. Its smooth sides reflected the rays of the sun, forming a staircase for the pharaoh's soul to ascend to the heavens. The location of these monuments, along the western bank of the Nile, aligned death with sunset and rebirth with the river's eternal flow. Building a pyramid required extraordinary organization. Engineers surveyed the land with astonishing precision. Workers were housed, fed, and managed in vast numbers. Food rations, tools, and schedules were recorded by scribes. Every block placed was an act of faith that the pharaoh's eternal life ensured the continued balance of the world. Contrary to later myths, these monuments were not built by slaves, but by skilled laborers and seasonal workers. They were farmers, artisans, and craftsmen fulfilling their duty to the gods and the king. Their labor was an extension of the same communal effort that had once dug canals and protected harvests. The Nile united them in purpose. Temples rose alongside tombs. Unlike pyramids, temples were spaces of interaction between gods and people. Located near the river, they served as ritual centers where offerings were made to ensure divine favor, especially the favor that kept the Nile's floods regular and generous. Processions often traveled by boat, carrying sacred statues along the river in reenactments of mythic journeys. Architecture became theology made visible. Columns were carved to resemble papyrus and lotus plants, symbols of Lower and Upper Egypt. Walls were inscribed with scenes of offerings, floods, and divine blessings. The very materials of the land, stone, water, sunlight, were shaped into sacred geometry. The Nile flowed not just outside these structures but through their meaning. Monumental building also reinforced political authority. Each temple and pyramid proclaimed the pharaoh's role as guarantor of Ma'at. The permanence of stone contrasted with the fleeting nature of human life, reminding all who saw these structures that Egypt was eternal. As long as the Nile flowed and the monuments stood, order would prevail. Yet these works were not isolated feats. They reshaped the landscape itself. Cities expanded around temple complexes. Trade networks grew to supply materials. Artistic conventions became standardized, reflecting a worldview rooted in balance and continuity. The Nile connected every quarry, workshop, and construction site into a single system. The act of building became a sacred cycle. Stone rose from the earth just as land rose from the floodwaters. Structures aligned with stars just as fields aligned with the seasons. In this harmony between nature and human intention, the Egyptians found reassurance that their civilization mirrored the divine order of the universe. By the end of the Old Kingdom, Egypt stood transformed. Its skyline was defined by pyramids. Its riverbanks were lined with temples. Its people lived within a world shaped by stone and sustained by water. The Nile had become the axis upon which eternity turned. But even stone cannot defy time forever. In the next chapter we will see how changes in climate, politics, and belief tested this carefully balanced system, and how the Nile remained both a source of resilience and vulnerability in the face of transformation. Chapter 5: Floods, Crisis, and the Test of Order. For centuries, the harmony between the Nile, the gods, and the pharaohs seemed unbreakable. The river flooded, the fields yielded their crops, and Egypt endured. Yet beneath this appearance of permanence lay a fragile truth: the entire system depended on balance. When that balance faltered, the foundations of civilization were tested. The Nile, though reliable, was not infallible. There were years when the inundation arrived too weak or too strong. A low flood meant insufficient water and thin layers of silt, leading to poor harvests. A flood that rose too high destroyed homes, canals, and storehouses. In both cases, the consequences rippled through society, threatening famine, unrest, and doubt. During periods of prolonged irregular floods, Egypt faced crisis. The end of the Old Kingdom offers one of the clearest examples. Evidence suggests that climatic shifts reduced rainfall in the Nile's upper regions, leading to a series of weak inundations. Crops failed repeatedly. Grain reserves dwindled. The centralized power of the pharaoh weakened as local governors struggled to provide for their people. In a civilization where the king's legitimacy was tied to the Nile's behavior, this was catastrophic. If the floods failed, had the gods withdrawn their favor? Had Ma'at been broken? Such questions undermined the divine image of kingship. As trust in the central authority eroded, regional leaders, known as nomarchs, asserted greater independence. Egypt fractured politically, entering what historians later called the First Intermediate Period. This era was marked by uncertainty. Without strong central control, irrigation systems fell into disrepair. Canals silted up. Floodwaters were poorly managed. The very infrastructure that once turned the Nile into a source of abundance now amplified its dangers. The river that had unified Egypt now revealed its capacity to divide it. Yet even in chaos, the Nile remained essential. Local communities adapted. They developed smaller, regional strategies for managing water and agriculture. In times of scarcity, cooperation became vital. Shared hardship reshaped social bonds, and new ideas about leadership and responsibility emerged. The river continued to teach lessons about resilience. Literature from this period reflects deep anxiety and reflection. Texts speak of disorder, hunger, and moral collapse, but also of hope for renewal. The Nile's cycles became metaphors for decline and rebirth. Just as the river could fail and return, so too could Egypt. Eventually, stability returned. From the south, new rulers rose who claimed the favor of the gods and the ability to restore Ma'at. They repaired canals, re-established grain distribution, and renewed religious rituals tied to the Nile. When the floods normalized, confidence returned. The Middle Kingdom was born. This new era brought a more nuanced understanding of power. Kingship remained sacred, but rulers emphasized justice, care for the people, and moral responsibility. The Nile was still divine, but its unpredictability was now acknowledged. Rather than unquestioned divine perfection, leadership became a partnership between human effort and divine will. Art, architecture, and literature flourished once more, often with a more introspective tone. Tombs became accessible to a wider segment of society, reflecting a democratization of the afterlife. The promise of renewal, once reserved for pharaohs, extended to officials and commoners alike, just as the Nile nourished all who lived along its banks. Trade expanded beyond Egypt's borders. The Nile served as the gateway to Africa, linking Egypt to Nubia and lands rich in gold, ivory, and exotic goods. Through its delta, Egypt connected to the Mediterranean world. Even in times of transition, the river anchored Egypt within broader networks of exchange and influence. But change was constant. Foreign invasions, internal struggles, and shifting climates continued to challenge the delicate balance. Each time, Egypt adapted, drawing once again on the lessons taught by the river. Flexibility, patience, and respect for natural cycles became cultural values embedded in Egyptian identity. By the end of this chapter of history, one truth stood clear. Egypt's greatness was not built on the illusion of eternal perfection, but on the ability to recover from disruption. The Nile, both generous and dangerous, shaped a civilization that learned to endure through change. In the final chapter, we will explore how this relationship between river and people echoed beyond ancient times, influencing Egypt's legacy, its survival through conquest, and its enduring place in human memory. Chapter 6: The Eternal River and the Memory of Egypt. Empires rise and fall, gods change names, and cities turn to dust. Yet through every transformation Egypt endured, one presence remained constant: the Nile. Long after the age of pyramids and divine kings had passed, the river continued to flow, carrying with it the memory of a civilization that had shaped the world. As centuries unfolded, Egypt faced waves of conquest. Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans each claimed the land at different times. New languages were spoken, new gods worshipped, and new rulers crowned. Yet none of them could alter the fundamental truth upon which Egypt was built. To rule Egypt was to understand the Nile. Foreign rulers quickly learned this lesson. The administration of flood cycles, taxation in grain, and control of irrigation remained unchanged in principle. Temples continued to monitor the river. Farmers still planted according to its rise and fall. Even as political power shifted, the ancient rhythm endured. The Nile outlived every dynasty. Under Greek rule, particularly during the Ptolemaic period, Egyptian beliefs blended with foreign traditions. Gods merged, myths adapted, but the river retained its sacred status. Festivals honoring the inundation persisted. The Nile was still seen as a divine gift, a reminder that Egypt's prosperity came not from kings alone, but from the land itself. When Rome absorbed Egypt, the river became a pillar of empire. Egyptian grain fed the city of Rome. Control of the Nile meant control of food security for millions. The ancient agricultural system, refined over thousands of years, proved so efficient that it sustained one of the greatest empires in history. Once again, the river demonstrated its power far beyond its banks. Yet time reshapes all things. With the spread of Christianity and later Islam, Egypt's religious landscape transformed. The old gods faded into memory, their temples abandoned or repurposed. Still, the Nile remained woven into daily life. New prayers replaced old hymns, but they were spoken by the same river. Faith changed, dependence did not. Medieval travelers marveled at the Nile's mystery. They spoke of its unknown sources, its miraculous floods, its ability to turn desert into green fields. Even as scientific understanding grew, the river retained an aura of wonder. It stood as proof that nature itself could shape destiny. In the modern age, humanity sought to master the Nile as never before. Dams were built, canals expanded, and floods controlled. The river that once dictated the rhythm of life was now regulated by human engineering. These achievements brought stability and growth, but they also altered ancient cycles. The seasonal floods that had nourished the land for millennia were tamed, and with them, a way of life faded. Yet even controlled, the Nile remains central. Cities like Cairo rise along its banks. Millions still depend on its waters. Farmers still look to it for survival. The ancient bond endures, though transformed by technology and time. What makes Egypt unique is not simply its monuments or myths, but the continuity of its relationship with the river. Few civilizations have lived in such intimate partnership with a single natural force for so long. The Nile shaped Egypt's economy, politics, religion, and identity in ways no conqueror could erase. The pyramids still stand, silent witnesses to this truth. They rise above the desert not as isolated wonders, but as expressions of a worldview born from water and soil. Every stone placed, every inscription carved, was made possible by the river that flowed beside them. Without the Nile, there would be no Egypt to remember. In this sense, the Nile is Egypt's greatest monument. It does not need walls or statues. It does not crumble or decay. It renews itself endlessly, just as it has for thousands of years. Where dynasties failed, the river endured. Where gods were forgotten, the river remained. The story of Egypt is, ultimately, the story of learning to live in harmony with nature, not by conquering it, but by understanding its rhythms. The ancient Egyptians watched the river, respected it, feared it, and honored it. In doing so, they built a civilization that outlived them. And so, as the Nile continues its journey from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, it carries more than water. It carries memory. Memory of the first farmers who settled its banks. Memory of kings who claimed divinity through its floods. Memory of temples, rituals, crises and rebirths. Memory of a civilization that learned, perhaps better than any other, that life itself flows in cycles. Long after the voices of the past have fallen silent, the Nile still speaks. And in its eternal flow, Egypt lives on.